Thanks everybody for coming. I know it's a busy time of year for all of us and not easy to make it to events such as these, but we have an excellent one scheduled. So I'm glad to see that you are able to find the time to join us. We're fortunate to have Professor Lucas Morel with us today. Professor Morel is the John K. Boardman Jr. Professor and head of the Politics Department at Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia. Before I pass on to more particulars about his professional accomplishments, of which there are a great many, I just want to thank him for a wonderful lunchtime conversation that he led earlier today with students on Lincoln's second inaugural address. He was very generous to offer us his time, his energy, and expertise, and what was, I thought, a very stimulating conversation. Professor Morel's accomplishments, his honors, and his publications are much too numerous for me to recite all of them here. Suffice it to say, just as a general remark, that he's a prolific scholar and writer, publishing both in scholarly journals and other publications, both online and in print. He has a deep expertise in American political history and American political thought, and above all, in the principles of American freedom and equality, the fight to end slavery, and the lingering aftermath of slavery. But I do want to highlight or bring to your attention a few particulars. Professor Morel is the author of 2 books on Abraham Lincoln. Most recently, Abraham Lincoln and the American Founding, that was published in 2020, and an earlier work, Lincoln's Sacred Effort, Defining Religion's Role in American Self-Government. In addition, he's the editor of Lincoln and Liberty, Wisdom for the Ages, and Ralph Ellison and the Raft of Hope, a political companion to Invisible Man. And finally, he's the co-editor of another volume on Ellison, The New Territory, Ralph Ellison and the 21st Century. In addition to his many, many writings on Lincoln and Ellison, one can also find essays and book chapters on figures such as Frederick Douglass, Malcolm X, and even Flannery O'Connor. Noteworthy, too, is what I might call Professor Morel's civic engagement. Since about 2004, he's been actively involved in leading workshops for high school teachers, for the Ashbrook Center, the Jack Miller Center, the Gilder Lehrman Institute, the Bill of Rights Institute, and the Liberty Fund. So we're very fortunate to have him with us today. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Professor Starr. You know my CV better than I do. Does this have to be just a little bit? Is
that okay for you?
For posterity, yes. Very good. I'm going to be talking about this book, Lincoln and the American Founding. I have a very basic thesis, and it's that there's no greater influence on Lincoln's statesmanship than the leading men, and especially the leading ideas that shaped America's revolution and constitutional formation. Simply put, if they had bumper stickers for the horse and buggy back in Lincoln's day, his carriage would have a bumper sticker that says, "I heart the American Founding." But the idea of getting right with the founders was not unique to Lincoln. In fact, the 2 main alternatives to the Republican Party during the 1860 presidential campaign and the ensuing secession winter, those alternatives both appealed to the founders to justify their respective policies. Northern Democrats supported Lincoln's longtime rival, Illinois Senator Stephen Arnold Douglas. Douglas argued that our revolutionary fathers were indifferent regarding the future of slavery in America. He claimed that they endorsed what he called popular sovereignty, local popular sovereignty, which permitted or banned slavery depending on the wishes of local white populations. He didn't think it was his position as a United States Senator to take a position or to exert influence, let alone any authority regarding the spread of slavery into the federal territories. Let the locals solve that. Southern Democrats rejected Douglass precisely because he would not ahead of time pledge support for what was known at the time as a federal slave code. They went on to secede from the Union of the American States, drawing language from the Declaration of Independence in doing so, and then modeling their Confederate Constitution after the US Constitution with, of course, some significant changes. James Thornwell of South Carolina insisted that secessionists were, quote, upholding the great principles which our fathers bequeathed, and the very liberty for which Washington bled, and which the heroes of the Revolution achieved, end quote. And so the election of 1860 was, in a relevant sense, a referendum on whose interpretation of the American founders was correct. Near the start of that election year, Lincoln exhorted Americans to have faith that right makes might. And he hoped to position the Republicans as the true heirs of the founding. Now, you can't talk about the founding without talking about the founder, and that means George Washington. So in my book, I start with the influence that Washington had on Lincoln, Washington's character, his piety, and his indispensable role as a conceiver and establisher of American self-government. But for Lincoln, more important than a founding man was a founding document, and that was the Declaration of Independence. On the way to his first inauguration as president, Lincoln said that he, quote, never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration. So in the second chapter of my book, the longest chapter, I explore how Lincoln's political thought was shaped by key principles of the Declaration and to some extent, its chief draftsman, Thomas Jefferson. Now, if the Declaration spells out the purposes or aims of the American regime, chapter 3 of my book focuses on the means of American self-government, and those are found in the United States Constitution. I examine why Lincoln preached what he called a reverence for the Constitution and laws, as well as the more perfect union of American states that the Constitution established. Now, you can't read the Declaration and then the Constitution and not notice where the Constitution fell short of the noblest aims of the Declaration. And so in chapter 4, I turn to what Lincoln learned from the founders' compromises with slavery, the institution that contradicted and undermined the founding experiment in self-government. My final chapter explains Lincoln's understanding of original intent as a political practice. In short, why should we follow the founders? This chapter examines how Lincoln understood his own respect for the founding in light of what he called progress, experience, and improvements, and therefore the responsibility of each generation to govern themselves under that Constitution in light of the ideals of the Declaration. Lincoln believed that during his contentious times, looking back to the founding could actually help Americans move forward. He did this most famously in his Gettysburg Address. That speech begins at the nation's beginning. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. If you do the math, you find that Lincoln takes his audience back not to the Constitution, but to the Declaration of Independence, not to the body, but to the soul of the nation. He goes on to explain that the Civil War was a test of America's purpose. As he put it, whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. In the midst of a fight for the very survival of the United States, a civil war, Lincoln thought the nation would benefit from looking to its past. Americans needed a reminder of why the nation was founded in the first place, and therefore why preserving the union of American states was so important. With Americans shooting not at a foreign enemy, but at each other. Clearly there was some confusion about the meaning of America. This is why, as president-elect, he called Americans God's almost chosen people. Lincoln believed Americans were undergoing essentially an identity crisis. They were no longer united in their understanding of why their nation existed. What were its highest aims and purposes? So in the middle of a fratricidal war, Lincoln believed that only by returning to the original intentions of the founders could Americans recover their unified purpose as a free people. At Gettysburg, Lincoln exhorted Americans to recommit themselves, to dedicate themselves to the task that remained, to honor the dead who fought at Gettysburg on behalf of the Union by sustaining the effort to preserve the American Union. It was a fight to defend a certain political way of life, what Lincoln called government of the people, by the people, for the people. Recall that Lincoln delivered his short speech, his few appropriate remarks, in the year of Jubilee, the year of emancipation. Union soldiers and sailors were now charged, since January 1st, charged by the president to protect the freedom of over 3 million legally freed black people. What Lincoln called a new birth of freedom was directly tied to the old, original birth of freedom, our first Emancipation Proclamation, the Declaration of Independence. Its central idea that all men are created equal described the natural state or condition of all human beings. So at Gettysburg, Lincoln did not announce a new principle of freedom, but affirmed an old one he learned from the Founding Fathers when they declared independence. Lincoln never sought to discover new rights for a new age. He never spoke of a living constitution, one where a visionary few would discern what would benefit the many. Instead, he spoke of the unfinished work to which the living, all the American people, could dedicate themselves. In this way, they could honor the men who fought and died at Gettysburg, those who here gave their lives that the nation might live. This was no Civil War epiphany of Lincoln's. In February 1861, as he headed to the nation's capital to be inaugurated as president, he stopped in Trenton, New Jersey, the capital of New Jersey, and he told the state Senate, "I am exceedingly anxious that this union, the Constitution, and the liberties of the people shall be perpetuated in accordance with the original idea for which that struggle was made. A nation devoted to the equal rights of every person is a nation worthy of the saving." Our temptation today is to think that everything new is by definition improved. But in Lincoln's time, there were some Americans arguing for something new, an improvement, as they understood it, over the American founders, but one which rejected what Lincoln considered the original idea of American independence. Consider Alexander Stephens of Georgia, a former Whig colleague of Lincoln's during Lincoln's sole term in Congress. As the vice president of the Confederate States of America, Stephens argued that their Constitution was better, was a better one than the old one Lincoln was trying to preserve, to hold on to. It was better, Stephens said, not because it protected slavery per se, by mentioning it explicitly, where the original Constitution never even used the word. There were plenty of regimes throughout human history that practiced slavery. Stephens argued that the Confederacy was the first to base its slave society on white supremacy. The racial basis of slavery was the improvement. He said that the American founders believed that, quote, the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle, socially, morally, politically. However, he lauded the Confederate Constitution because it was founded upon exactly the opposite idea. He said its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. Stephens added, "This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth." Stephens argued that the anti-slavery principles of the founding were, in his mind, fundamentally wrong. He said, they rested upon the assumption of the equality of races. He called this an error, a sandy foundation, unlike the new and improved Constitution he helped draft for the Confederacy. Nevertheless, in the decade leading up to the Civil War, Lincoln's chief political target was not slave-owning Southerners, but complacent white Northerners, especially those led by Senator Stephen Douglas of the Free State of Illinois. Lincoln criticized Douglas's notion of popular sovereignty because it was neutral on the slave question. Douglas, as I mentioned, believed that whites at the local level, whether in states or federal territories, had the right to decide the question without interference from Congress. In other words, whether slavery would expand or diminish in the United States under Douglas's definition of popular sovereignty would be determined not by a majority of all American citizens, but by a very small majority of the settlers who went to live out west. In reference to the enslavement of black people out west, Douglas said, "I don't care whether it be voted up or down." This indicated to Lincoln that the greatest obstacle to reducing slavery in the U.S. was Douglas teaching white Northerners to become indifferent to the plight of black people in the federal territories. And this is how Lincoln put it. They tell us that they desire the people of a territory to vote slavery out or in as they please. The question arises, slavery or freedom? Caring nothing about it, they let it come in. And that is the end of it. It is the surest way of nationalizing the institution. Just as certain, but more dangerous, because more insidious. But it is leading us there just as certainly and as surely as Jeff Davis himself would have us go. What made Douglas's don't care policy in the territory so insidious to Lincoln was that for slavery to become national, no politician north of the Mason-Dixon line had to make an argument in favor of it. Following Douglas, simply get white Americans in the free states not to care if black slavery expanded into federal territory. Once slavery was accepted as a constitutional right in that territory, it would soon become legal in the free states, regardless of what their laws or constitutions said. So in his debates with Douglas in 1858, Lincoln warned that popular sovereignty, coupled now with the recent 1857 decision in Dred Scott v. Sanford, would produce precisely this outcome in the not-too-distant future. Remarkably, in Illinois, where blacks possessed very few civil rights and no political rights, Lincoln consistently stood up for their possession of natural rights. Where Douglas was emphatic in reading black people out of the Declaration, Lincoln believed it included, in principle, black people, all people, everywhere. Tempted by Douglas to stray from its original commitment to human equality, America was becoming a country Lincoln no longer recognized. So he called upon our ancient faith, as he put it, to guide the country back to its noblest ideals and practices. Looking back to the founders couldn't have been more relevant to the crisis the nation faced in the 1850s. But appealing to the founders was something, as I mentioned earlier, Senator Douglas also did. He was not only Lincoln's nemesis, but the leading Democrat, and therefore the leading politician throughout the decade of the 1850s. He claimed he knew better than Lincoln what the founders thought about the question of slavery. Douglas claimed his policy aligned more closely with the founders' intentions for the new republic. In Lincoln's mind, the future of freedom and the eventual demise of slavery depended on whose reading of the founders was correct and could best unite a divided country. Lincoln argued that at the founding of the United States, slavery was viewed and treated as a necessary evil. But it had become in the slaveholding states, to quote South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun, a positive good. The founders also agreed that where slavery already existed in the states, Congress would have no authority over the institution because of the federal nature of the Constitution. Slavery, what was known as, at the time, as a domestic institution, governed mostly, almost entirely, by state authority. Since the beginning of the United States, the powers of government were divided between state governments and the national government, the federal government. Because slavery existed prior to the formation of the United States, it remained a state institution. If the states themselves didn't abolish, it could not be abolished by Congress short of a constitutional amendment. With the population growing faster in the free states than in the slaveholding states, the future of slavery in America would be decided by the votes of white Northerners. Lincoln believed that Congress did have authority to ban slavery in the only land possessed by the American people at large, and that was the federal territories. However, tempted by Stephen Douglas's popular sovereignty, slavery's fate might be determined not by moral right, but by mere self-interest, meaning those who could profit by taking black people into the territories and making them slaves. But if white Northerners agreed with Douglas that Congress did not have authority to regulate the domestic affairs of the territories, then his declared indifference would actually represent, in Lincoln's words, covert real zeal for the spread of slavery. And so Lincoln was at pains to tie the future security of the rights of white people to the present insecurity of the rights of black people. Those same white Americans would have to decide if what happened to people who did not look like them, enslaved black people in the South, potentially being taken into federal territory, had anything to do with the kind of country in which they wanted to live. For Lincoln, the necessary connection could be found not only in the thinking, but also the practice of the American founders. Case in point, when the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 opened both territories north of the 3630 parallel to the possibility of slavery, it contradicted the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which banned slavery from that very territory. Lincoln pointed out that the founding generation, as well as the generations that followed in the early republic, they acted to restrict the expansion of slavery in the United States. They did so by banning slavery from the Northwest Territory in 1787 and by stopping the importation of slaves in 1808, all in hopes of putting slavery, as Lincoln put it, on the course of ultimate extinction. Lincoln lamented how the nation had departed from its original approach to abolishing the pre-existing institution of slavery in a peaceful, gradual manner. And this is Lincoln. The plain, unmistakable spirit of that age towards slavery was hostility to the principle, toleration only by necessity. But now it is transformed into a sacred right. Nebraska brings it forth, places it on the high road to extension and perpetuity. Little by little, but steadily as man's march to the grave, we have been giving up the old for the new faith. The new faith was Douglas's perversion of true popular sovereignty. His was a crude majoritarianism that rejected the self-evident truth that all men are created equal. It made the rights of black people depend on the arbitrary will of local white majorities. Lincoln rejected this legal positivism and preached a return to what he called our ancient faith, the faith of the fathers. He declared, "Our Republican robe is soiled and trailed in the dust. Let us repurify it. Let us turn it and wash it white in the spirit, if not the blood of the revolution. Let us turn slavery from its claims of moral right back upon its existing legal rights and its arguments of necessity. Let us return it to the position our fathers gave it, and there let it rest in peace." Wonderful pun. Lincoln called upon Americans to re-adopt the Declaration of Independence. In so doing, they would not only have saved the Union, but in his words, so saved it as to make and to keep it forever worthy of the saving. That was October 1854. A country worthy of the saving needed to be a country that at least limited the spread of slavery as the first step to its eventual demise. In short, a don't care policy was not worthy of Lincoln's generation of Americans because it betrayed the intentions of the fathers of the American Republic. In December 1860, now President-elect Abraham Lincoln received a letter from none other than Alexander Stephens, who would soon become the Vice President of the Confederate States of America. Stephens wanted Lincoln to speak to the nation before his March 4th, 1861 inauguration. Stephens says, "To save our common country, you should do this." And then Stephens quoted Proverbs 25. "A word fitly spoken by you now would be like apples of gold and pictures of silver." This prompted Lincoln to jot a note to himself, a reflection on what he called the philosophical cause of American prosperity. For someone who had long revered the Constitution and saw the union of the American states as essential to the success of the Republic, Lincoln wrote, quote, "Even these are not the primary cause of our great prosperity. There is something back of these, entwining itself more closely about the human heart. That something is the principle of liberty to all, the principle that clears the path for all, gives hope to all, and by consequence, enterprise and industry to all." And then he alluded to Proverbs 25:11. The assertion of that principle at that time was the word fitly spoken, which has proved an apple of gold to us. The Union and the Constitution are the picture of silver subsequently framed around it. The picture was made not to conceal or destroy the apple, but to adorn and preserve it. The picture, the frame, the setting was made for the apple, not the apple for the picture. So contrary to what Stephens asked of Lincoln, what the country needed was not a new word from their new president, but old words, the words of their forefathers expressed in the Declaration of Independence. Lincoln saw the Declaration's principle of liberty to all, as he paraphrased it, the equal rights possessed by all human beings, as the moral compass of a constitution and union that could otherwise be misinterpreted, even broken in pursuit of tyrannical ends. A year before he was elected president, Lincoln was asked to give a speech in Boston on the anniversary of Thomas Jefferson's birth. He could not make the trip, but he sent a letter that was essentially an ode to Jefferson's achievement in drafting the Declaration. He wrote, quote, "The principles of Jefferson are the definitions and axioms of a free society." Now, for someone who studied Euclid's geometry while in Congress, Lincoln was an odd duck. Lincoln was referring to the Declaration's principles as the building blocks of a democratic society. Lincoln observed, however, that even self-evident truths can be denied and evaded, as was the case when he wrote that letter in 1859. Still, Lincoln said, "This is a world of compensations. He who would be no slave must consent to have no slave." Alluding to Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia, he observed, "Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves, and under a just God cannot long retain it." These were astounding words for Lincoln, the Republican and former Whig, given the success that states' rights Democrats achieved in donning the mantle of Jefferson, one of the founders of the Democratic Party. Still, Lincoln declared all honor to Jefferson, to the man who, in the concrete pressure of a struggle for national independence by a single people, had the coolness, forecast, and capacity to introduce into a merely revolutionary document an abstract truth applicable to all men at all times, And so to embalm it there, that today and in all coming days it shall be a rebuke and a stumbling block to the very harbingers of reappearing tyranny and oppression. In looking back to Jefferson, Lincoln looked back to a founding generation that put the principles of civil society and legitimate government in writing. Principles he believed applied in his day and obligated Americans to renew their commitment to eliminating slavery as fast as circumstances should permit. Lincoln's anti-slavery convictions were the very thing that informed his devotion to the Constitution. Like the founders, Lincoln believed that but for the union of the American states, there would be no freedom for whites or blacks. This was no innovation on Lincoln's part, but rather the abiding conviction of Americans who knew their colonial and revolutionary history. Liberty required political independence from foreign powers. Independence required unity among the American colonies. To maintain American unity, to maintain that American Union, required compromises be made, especially regarding slavery. As Lincoln put it, I think that was the condition in which we found ourselves when we established the government. We had slavery among us. We could not get our Constitution unless we permitted them to remain in slavery. We could not secure the good we did secure if we grasped for more. Having by necessity submitted to that much, it does not destroy the principle that is the charter of our liberties. Time and again, Lincoln's references to the founders centered on how they tried to establish a government based on human equality, but by that very equality, imposed upon themselves a moral necessity to abolish slavery in a manner consistent with the consent that was the flip side of the equality coin. As Lincoln put it late in the war, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think or feel. And yet I have never understood that the presidency conferred upon me unrestricted right to act officially upon this judgment and feeling. This distinction between official duty and personal wish, a distinction Lincoln made most famously in his 1862 public letter to Horace Greeley before he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, demonstrates most clearly Lincoln's concern that Americans follow the rule of law in their pursuit of justice. With a draft of the Emancipation Proclamation in his desk, he wrote in a public letter a response to Horace Greeley. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. In America, the means of securing liberty, these means need to be consistent with the end. To emancipate slaves as president in a time of war, Lincoln had to turn a humanitarian end into a constitutional means. This way, emancipation would be not only an act of justice, but also an act warranted by the Constitution upon military necessity. By finding a constitutional way to liberate slaves, Lincoln sought to make both his means and his ends a faithful expression of the consent of the American people. Lincoln made a correct view of the founding central to the nation's response to alternative interpretations promoted by influential figures like Chief Justice Roger Taney and Senator Stephen Douglas. Unlike Lincoln, Taney and Douglas thought the Declaration was true only for white people. They read it that way to protect the slaveholding founders from charges of hypocrisy. In 1857, Taney wrote in his Dred Scott opinion, the enslaved African race were not intended to be included, formed no part of the people who framed and adopted this declaration. For if the language as understood in that day would embrace them, the conduct of the distinguished men who framed the Declaration of Independence would have been utterly and flagrantly inconsistent with the principles they asserted. That's Chief Justice Taney. A year later, Stephen Douglas, echoed this reading of the Declaration. If they included Negroes in that term, they were bound as conscientious men that day and that hour, not only to have abolished slavery throughout the land, but to have conferred political rights, privileges on the Negro, elevated him to an equality with the white man. The very fact that they did not shows that they did not understand the language they used to include any but the white race. To make profession and practice consistent at the American founding, and to make the founders worthy of admiration by later generations, Taney and Douglas interpreted the founders' profession in light of their practice. If the founding generation did not immediately free their slaves, they must not have seen Africans as created equal to Englishmen or their descendants. That was their argument. In response to the Dred Scott opinion, Lincoln commented on the equality principle stated in the Declaration. On his reading, the founders, quote, did not mean to assert the obvious untruth that all were then actually enjoying that equality, nor yet that they were about to confer it immediately upon them. In fact, they had no power to confer such a boon. They meant simply to declare the right, so that the enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances should permit. Lincoln understood the founders not as hypocritical politicians, but as prudent revolutionaries. They recognized that circumstances, like a war with Great Britain and long-standing prejudice and practice, did impede their efforts to secure these rights. Furthermore, Lincoln pointed out that the founders' inaction regarding enslaved black people in their midst was no different than their inaction toward white citizens in America. He said, they did not at once or ever afterwards actually place all white people on an equality with one another. They meant simply to set up a standard maxim for free society, which could be familiar to all, revered by all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and thereby constantly spreading and deepening its influence, augmenting the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors everywhere. Put simply, at the time of the founding, Americans, white Americans, did not believe they could both free themselves and free their slaves without hazarding the success of both their independence and their new way of governing themselves. Lincoln's respect for the American founding, which established a new nation devoted to securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, recognized both the noble ends to which that nation was dedicated and the prudent means adopted to achieve those ends. As a student of the American founding, Lincoln became its greatest defender, not simply because he fought and fought successfully to save the American Union, but also because he explained, in words yet to be surpassed, why America was worthy of the saving. In doing so, he taught us the true principles of self-government, and thus, I believe, can still help us find common ground for promoting a common future as a free and united people. Thank you.